Well, we begin this morning in our studies in the book of Ruth. And this book has been described in various ways. One of the commentators describes it as the most beautiful book in the entire Old Testament. One of them describes it as a model in the art of storytelling. The book is set, as the first verse tells us, in the context of the period of the Judges. And if you do some sums based on the characters that appear in the book, you can work out that actually the book of Ruth occurs fairly near the beginning of the book of Judges. The book is centred around a family from Bethlehem. And it charts their progress. It charts their griefs, and it charts their joys. The book introduces us to the ancestry of the great King David. And the book also reveals that true faith is not the exclusive domain of the descendants of Abraham. But true faith can also be found in Gentile people. But the main theme of this book is the providence of God. That God provides. And it shows God's provision. It is, if you like, a great illustration of the provision of God. And it shows God's provision not just in bounty, but in times of need and necessity. It shows God's provision in the highs and also the lows. We see God's providence in all of these things. And as we go through this book, if you learn nothing else, learn this. That we need to evaluate our lives in the highs and lows. We need to evaluate them as the outworking of the providence of God. God is providing, and sometimes his provision is not what we would expect or even what we would want. Now, I want us to see in the first few verses this morning, hopefully covering verses 1 to 5, three things. I've entitled the sermon, Out of the Frying Pan. And I want us to think first of the frying pan. Testing times. Testing times. Because those first 5 verses, and to a degree other parts of the first chapter, they present to us a spiral of decline and of tragedy. And in a sense, it's quite heartbreaking and heart-wrenching as we trace what happens to this little family. Let's think first of all about the context of the book and of this family. It says it was in the days of the Judges. Well, what was special about the days of the Judges? Well, you remember that the children of Israel had come out of Egypt, they'd gone through the wilderness, and they'd entered into the land of promise, and they had conquered it under the leadership of Joshua. And that conquest of the land was finished, to all intents and purposes. There were still pockets of resistance. There were still groups of people dotted here and there that had not been conquered. But essentially the attention of the people of God turned away from conquest, from war, towards building the peace. They settled towards building their lives, building their homes, building their businesses. And it's in this atmosphere of peace and prosperity and building that a materialism emerges. And at the same time, there is a steep decline in the worship of Jehovah. There is spiritual neglect. It's very instructive that as you read through the book of Judges, the first time you have direct reference to the tabernacle is in chapter 20, verse 18. The true religion, the worship of Jehovah, was abandoned. Now, when true religion is abandoned, it doesn't leave a vacuum. The vacuum is always filled with something. And during the time of the Judges, we see that vacuum being filled. We see a tolerance for false religion. And that tolerance develops into acceptance of false religion. And that acceptance develops into embracing false religion. And with the advance of false religion comes moral decay. So you read through the book of Judges, you can see the progression of moral decay until you get to the end of the book and you shudder at the abominations that were carried out amongst the people of God. The book tells us how the people of God were oppressed by their enemies. And it reveals to us too how the people of God resorted to tearing themselves apart, to being at one another's throats. There were periods of deliverance. But the book ends with these words, and the children of Israel departed thence at that time, every man to his tribe and to his family, and they went out from thence, every man to his inheritance. In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Now those verses are very instructive. They reveal to us two key elements of the period of the Judges. One was relativism, where there was no absolute truth. What's true for me was true for me, and what's true for you is true for you, and don't you dare tell me what's true for me, and I mustn't possibly tell you what's true for you. There's nothing absolute. Everything's shifting and relative. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. But together with the relativism was individualism. It was in my own eyes. Self was key. And there was no unifying influence bringing that individualism to an end. There was no king in Israel. There was no unifying religion, Jehovah, and there was no unifying king, no unifying influence. Every man to himself. That's the context. But the next thing we see here is that there was a famine. A famine. A famine? You say a famine? Yes, a famine. Didn't God promise that this land of Canaan was a land flowing with milk and honey? Wasn't the land of Canaan renowned as a place where God was blessing? Wasn't Canaan the place of abundance, the place of fruitfulness, the place of sweetness? Didn't the spies bring back this huge cluster of grapes to demonstrate, to display the fruitfulness of the land? And wasn't the heart of its provision in terms of its arable farming Bethlehem, the house of bread? Bethlehem was the breadbasket of Canaan. A famine? What a turnaround. This land was now reduced to barrenness. Its people, instead of enjoying milk and honey, well, they were hungry. They were malnourished. And it clearly has an impact on this family. Notice the two names of the two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Mahlon means pining, sickness. Chilion means consumption. This should not have come as a surprise to the people of God. They had been warned that this would happen. Didn't Moses tell them that this would happen? Listen to his words in Leviticus 26. Ye shall make you no idols, the very thing they'd done, nor graven image, neither rear up a standing image, neither shall ye set up any image of stone in your land to bow down unto it, for I am the Lord your God. Ye shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. But if ye will not hearken unto me, and will not do all these commandments, and if ye shall despise my statutes, or if your soul shall abhor my judgments, so that ye will not do any of my commandments, but that ye break my covenant, I also will do this unto you. I will even appoint over you terror, consumption, Chilion, and the burning ague that shall consume the eyes and cause sorrow of heart, and ye shall sow your seed in vain, for your enemies shall eat it. And I will set my face against you, and ye shall be slain before your enemies. They that hate you shall reign over you, and ye shall flee when none pursueth you. And if ye will not yet for all this hearken unto me, then I will punish you 7 times more for your sins. And I will break the pride of your power, and I will make your heaven as iron, and your earth as brass, and your strength shall be spent in vain, and your land shall not yield her increase, neither shall the trees of the land yield their fruits. There it is. God told them. But they never listened. And it wasn't just that God told them once. Just before Moses died, you remember that he said, when you get into this land, you put half the tribes of Israel on one hill, and they will recite the blessings of God for keeping his law. And you put the other tribes on another hill on the opposite side of the valley, and they will recite the curses of God for breaking his law. But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. Cursed shalt thou be in the city, cursed shalt thou be in the field. Cursed shall be thy basket and thy store. Cursed shall be the fruit of thy body and the fruit of thy land, the increase of thy kine and the flocks of thy sheep. Cursed shalt thou be when thou comest in, and cursed shalt thou be when thou goest out. God did tell them. He did. And the people of Naomi's day, they should have said, didn't God tell us? This is the judgment of God. Let me ask you a question. Doesn't this context, this setting, and the characteristics of this age, don't they sound horribly familiar? When you think about the characteristics of 21st century Britain, doesn't all this in the Judges sound familiar to us? The materialism. Aren't we consumed by materialism? Trying to better ourselves. It's all consuming. Our children, they must have the latest technology, the best trainers, the smartest jeans, the clothes that fit in with what their friends have. We're obsessed with it. When I was preparing this, I heard a program on the radio when they were discussing what is poverty. And they were interviewing this woman who was poor. And they said to her, what does poverty mean for you? How does it manifest itself in your life? And she said, well, I realised I was poor when I couldn't pay for my children to have horse riding lessons. That's poverty? Poverty? What sort of a world is this? And in our day, the worship of God has been almost abandoned wholesale. Look around Rumney. How many people are coming out of their homes this morning to worship the Lord? What do we represent, assuming we all lived in Rumney? What would we represent of the number of people that live in Rumney? 0.005%? Faith in Jesus has been neglected. And of course, when that happens, it doesn't leave a vacuum that isn't filled. The vacuum has been filled. Look at all the cyclists that you pass on the way to church. And the runners. It's been filled by this obsession with fitness. But it's also been filled by a lot of false religion and false thinking. We live in an age when diversity is the kind of talk of the town. And all forms of perverted immorality are celebrated. Every perversion conceivable is being promoted. And every man is doing that which is right in his own eyes. We live in an age of relativism and of individualism. But there is something worse as well. We're living in a famine. A famine. Now, I'm sure you had cereals or whatever, toast or whatever it was you had for breakfast this morning. There's no physical famine. But there is a spiritual famine. A famine that's described by Amos. He puts it like this: Behold, the days come, saith the Lord God, that I will send a famine in the land, not a famine of bread, nor a thirst for water, but of hearing the words of the Lord. and they shall wander from sea to sea, and from the north even to the east, and they shall run to and fro to seek the word of the Lord, and shall not find it. A famine of the soul. A famine of the word of God. A famine that leaves our souls malnourished. I don't know how widely travelled you are in Britain. But you know, the places where you can get your soul fed on a Sunday are getting fewer and further between. Yeah, there's a lot of religion. There's a lot of razzmatazz. But feeding the soul... You know, there are some folk that go miles and miles and miles every Sunday to hear the word of the Lord. Well, what do we do? What do we do when such a famine comes to the people of God? Well, what did this family do? Out of the frying pan is what they did. We see, secondly, the fleeing family. I don't know how long they sat there in their home in Bethlehem, but they probably discussed this much and agonised over it. But eventually, Elimelech and Naomi come to the decision, we have to do something. What are our options? They discussed them, and well, the only option that seemed to fit was to escape and to emigrate. So like Abraham and Isaac before them, who experienced famine in this land before it was possessed by the people of Israel, they decide they will leave their troubles behind. They will leave all this and go elsewhere. But the question is where? Where to go? Now notice their destination. They went to the country of Moab. So if you've got a Bible and with maps in the back of it, you can probably follow the track that they went. They went from Bethlehem. They went northwards up to Jericho in a kind of northeasterly direction. Then they crossed over the River Jordan to the east in the reverse direction that Joshua took, of course, when he crossed over the River Jordan to Jericho. And then they turned south round the east side of the Dead Sea, and they go through the territory of Reuben until they come to the River Arnon. And then they cross the River Arnon and leave the people of Israel and the land of promise behind. And they enter into Moab. Moab. Why? Why Moab? Wasn't it the Moabites that hired Balaam to curse the people of Israel? Wasn't it the Moabite women who seduced the people of Israel to commit sin with Baal Peor, and God struck them down with an epidemic and 24,000 people died? What doest thou here, Elimelech? What are you doing? What are you thinking of? It says of Cain, he went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And it could equally be said of Elimelech. He went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Moab on the east of the Dead Sea. Moab. Why? What's his motivation? Why go there? Well, very interesting. The book of Ruth records none of the words of Elimelech at all. He is silent. He kept his motivation to himself. But I guess it was fairly obvious. He was looking for bread. He was looking to provide for his family, and of course there's nothing wrong with that. Doesn't Paul tell Timothy, he that provides not for his own has denied the faith and is worse than an infidel? Maybe they thought, well, the warmer, drier climate of Moab might be better for the boy's health. Others in Bethlehem stayed put. It was almost as if they were magnetised by the inheritance that they'd received from the Lord. But for Naomi and Elimelech, the inheritance didn't really have the same drawing power. It didn't have enough power to keep them among the people of God. Indeed, we see from chapter 4 later on, by God's grace we'll get to it, they mortgaged their inheritance in order to raise some funds, some cash, to fund their emigration. Even in this passage, Naomi says, okay, we have to kind of take it with a pinch of salt that she isn't exaggerating, but she says, I went out full. Their pockets are bulging with cash. They were refugees, but that wasn't all that there was to it. There was a serious element here of being an economic migrant. They were wanting to better themselves. They were wanting to live an easier, more prosperous life. Maybe they were infected with the materialism of the age. The worship of Jehovah, the tabernacle, it wasn't important enough in their lives to keep them among the people of God. And notice the duration. They probably discussed it and justified this move amongst themselves by saying, well, this is only temporary. Just while the trouble lasts, the famine will be over soon and then we'll be back. Now, notice what it says in verse 1. Sojourn. They went to camp out there until the trouble was past. But notice what it says in verse 2. They continued there. In other words, they settled there. And notice what it says in verse 4. 10 years. Their intention was short term. But the reality wasn't short term at all. Listen, my friends. When there's famine in the church, what do? I'm not sure that we have really realised as Christian people how much we've been infected with the spirit of the age, with the thinking of our generation. Oh, this coronavirus. How many people will actually be infected by it? Many of those will show no symptoms at all, but they will still be infected. And maybe that will be true of us spiritually, infected by the virus of the age that we live in, the thinking of the age. It may not be abundantly obvious, but it's still there, manipulating our thinking, our decision making. You know, it's very easy for us to get caught up in the treadmill of bigger, newer, better. And at the same time, the church can be a tough place to be. Shouldn't be like that, but it can be. Let's be honest about it. There are disagreements in the church. At times there are even open hostilities in the church. And then, at times, very little to satisfy our souls in the church. And the temptation? Blow that for a laugh. I'm emigrating from church. Do you know there are times when our friends and neighbours and work colleagues appear warmer to us and provide more genuine friendship than people at church? Now, I have a friend who's a Christian, and he said something to me years back that shocked me. He said, "Do you know what, Tim? I have more friends at work than I've got at church." I was staggered by it. But I can see now he was speaking the truth. What do we do? What do we do when it's like that? Well, the easiest thing is just to step back from church and to refuse to put our backs into the work of the Lord and to settle down to a more comfortable, easier life outside the realm of blessing. Tell me, you're here this morning, but spiritually, are you in Moab? How long have you been there? The family went out of the frying pan. Well, thirdly, we need to see the family going into the fire. Thirdly, the crushing crisis. You see, all was going well. When they arrived, all was going well. They probably began to make some cash, some shekels in the pocket, and maybe they even had a discussion. Naomi, things are going all right. We're more prosperous now than we've been for a while, even since the day we got married. Things are going all right. Maybe we can slacken the belt a bit, and we don't need to be quite as strict in our austerity as we have been. But spiritually, they were bankrupt. And then, wham! Elimelech died. It's all so sudden. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. It came out of nowhere. They had promised themselves that they would return. But there was no warning. And now, well, they couldn't return. Now it was too late. Now there was no way back. It never crossed their minds that they would be buried anywhere else than in their father's sepulchres in Bethlehem. But now, Elimelech is laid in the grave in the country of his choice, Moab. And now Naomi and the boys, they have to take up the strain together. And they do that, and then something else comes on the horizon. Women. Probably the older boy first, and then the next one second, but they each declare their love for a local Moabite. And love is followed by betrothal, and betrothal is followed by marriage. Now, when Naomi had been back in Bethlehem, if she'd heard of such a thing, she would have tutted and frowned. Marrying someone who's not an Israelite? Tut, tut, tut. Now, of course, this wasn't against the letter of the law. They were only forbidden from marrying Canaanites. But it was against the spirit of the law. But without Elimelech, maybe Naomi felt a little powerless against the wishes of her sons. And maybe she had a guilty feeling inside that, do you know what, possibly this is a direct consequence of the decision they made all those years ago. Moabites! Moabites! Maybe that decision was beginning to haunt her. Her sons had married idol worshippers. Idol worshippers. And then the last blow. The knockout punch. Well, in fact, it was a combination. A left hook and a right hook. Mahlon and Chalion died. Both of them. One after the other. And Naomi is reeling with grief. First Mahlon, then Chalion. Now listen, the boys had never been strong. Their names reflect that. But never in Naomi's worst nightmare has such a catalogue of tragedies overtaken her. One can only imagine the sense of desolation and grief and heartbreak as the three stricken widows buried Naomi's sons beside their father. Naomi's dreams were shattered. Her hopes were dashed to pieces. Finished. Broken. Broken. And maybe, my friends, you look back on your life and you say, you know what? If I knew how this was going to turn out, I would have done things differently. Hindsight is an amazing thing. Sometimes not that helpful. But maybe at the time when you made your decisions that maybe you're thinking were wrong, maybe at the time you had your doubts. Your conscience was kind of not completely at ease with it. You had no idea that that decision that you made was going to bring you so much grief and have such profound negative consequences for your life and be so damaging in its influence on your family. Maybe you look back and you can see how you've reaped the rewards of rejecting and neglecting family worship and instructing your children. You never expected the path of disobedience to end up like this. But maybe you've experienced blow after blow like Naomi. And you appraise your own situation, you say, I feel empty, comfortless, broken. God bless you. You're a broken Christian. Take heart. Take heart. God wasn't finished with Naomi. And God isn't finished with you. There are chapters yet, chapters. And God still has chapters in your life. Chapters. Listen. The writer to the Hebrews puts it like this. No chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness to them which are exercised thereby. It does have benefits in the long run. There are positive consequences that are coming from this. And the writer to the Hebrews tells us what to do. You know, when we feel broken, we can sit around moping and feeling sorry for ourselves. No, he says, don't do that. Lift up the hands which hang down and the feeble knees and make straight paths for your feet. That's what you must do. Come on. God has a plan. God has a plan for you. God is working all things to his plan. Well, we've begun. And by God's grace, we shall continue in the weeks and months ahead. Amen.
Amen.